Hey guys, welcome to SAP Mix Studio Umbiamas, conectando Aruba com o mundo via vídeo podcasting. Conectar conosco, compartilhar ideias e histórias para nos inspirar e para nos abrir. SAP Mix Studio é a plataforma de podcast na Aruba. Follow-nos no Facebook, subscribe no YouTube ou na plataforma de podcast preferida. Escute o podcast preferido que hora e onde está. SAP Mix Studio, powered by Qredits. Botou ideia? Qredits educa e prepara a para ser um empresário exitoso. De business plan, guia personal e préstamo para negócio até com 100,000 florin. Bira para mês donho com Qredits. Subway. Passa na Subway para o sop, salada, wrap ou flatbread e mais fresco. Com 7 localidades rond Aruba. Nós está cerca de Subway. Swingmasters. Organizando events, conferences of weddings, Mr. de luz, sound, staging, DJ, trussing of LED screen, Swingmasters está claro para ser boa fiesta êxito. Swingmasters. E agora, SAP Mix Studio é plataforma de podcast de Aruba, está apresentar.
Sincerely Carolina is powered by Lindy Boutique, Proframe, Gelatissimo, Neutrogena, and Purina.
Hi, happy Monday. Welcome to Sincerely Carolina. Happy new week. I hope your weekend was fun. Also, welcome back because we had a rewatch last week. I took a small break to just take some time off. And I don't know if you can see it through the cam, but I also have a tan because I decided to finally try out surfing after many, many years of convincing. I did it. So much fun. Now I'm happy and now I'm like, when are we going to go again? So I just wanted to share that with all of you. But yes, so first of all, I want to say thank you to SAP Mix Studio for making Sincerely Carolina possible. Did I say I'm Carolina? I'm Carolina. I'm your host. Also, thank you to my awesome sponsors, Lindy Boutique. By the way, go check out all her new brands. She has like a bunch of new brands coming in, and I was able to go to the event that she had. Anyways, bunch of cute stuff, so go check it out. Also, the Shelf and Proframe, they also have a bunch of really beautiful things, especially as Mother's Day is coming up. So do go check it out. But yes, thank you to them. And I have here with me Dr. Paula Kibbelaar once again. Last time was super fun, super nice. And so I decided I need to invite her again and we need to talk a little bit more. So we are going to talk about diversity and inclusion, but more about the impact. So we have been talking about, special needs in general. And we did have the women's series where we talked about women's issues, but now I really want us to think about how this really impacts us all and if we decide to really work towards inclusion and true diversity, the positive impact that it can have. But without further ado, Dr. Paula, can you please introduce yourself?
Wow, such a nice introduction. Again, sincerely,
I tried.
I am honored to be invited again by you. I'm
Yay.
actually very excited and a little bit flabbergasted. That,
Why?
That I was invited again, but I'm looking forward to this conversation. And
Yes.
it's one of my topics, so one of my research themes. So I'm very happy and honored to sit here next to you again.
Yay. So, Paula, can you please tell our listeners a little bit about your background, what you studied, how come you're an expert on these topics, right? Because I think they want to know why you're going to educate us today.
Well, it's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation.
Yes.
And that is the whole thing with the word inclusion. We are just trying to make a certain statement, but also to raise consciousness about certain sensitive topics, perhaps sometimes. Well, my background, as I already mentioned a month ago, during this fantastic conversation about women's issues, I am an anthropologist. So I studied at University of Utrecht years ago. And anthropology is the study of cultural differences, actually. And it's always about the notion of the other.
Okay.
And how do we deal with la différence, as they say in French?
Okay.
How do we cope with things that are not ours or that not resemble ours? And how do we describe them or analyze them in order for us to understand or comprehend or change or manage the differences in our society, particularly. And anthropology is always a study of non-Western cultures.
Okay.
But so it has it has a kind of a condition that you have to position yourself somewhere in order for you to be able to study or to understand another culture or the other. So I studied anthropology, cultural anthropology, which was very classical mainstream, and then I specialized myself in women's studies and ethnic and multicultural studies, later on in governance and development studies, and I did my PhD in gender and ethnicity and gender and diversity. So that is why I think they call me an expert, and at least in the Netherlands, in Curaçao. And in Aruba, I really specialized myself in sustainable inclusive development. And what does that mean? Which is a broader spectrum. That is a broader framework than development studies. All the other aspects that I studied were actually micro topics within the framework of a sustainable, inclusive world, because that is what we want, of course.
Yes.
And so this is a blueprint, it's a kind of a to-do list. How do we preserve our Earth, our planet? How do we deal with each other? How do we really interact with each other in such a way that future generations can inherit a world, a society, a planet better than we...
And we found it, right?
Where did we find it? I think we're still busy. We're still
busy finding it.
We're still in the process of really
True.
Getting the things done, the to-do list out there,
True.
I think. But then I studied also in the States, which was really a fantastic experience, because in the States, the whole issue of diversity, at least when I was a student, was popping up. It's constantly an issue, of course, because it's an immigrant country, and everywhere you see the difference, you see the other, and so that was a highlight in my study time, to really understand where this comes from. And globalization and immigration, it's really the root, the cause of that we have to be able to deal with difference. And also in Aruba, which was something that I really had to confront. I've always been exposed to differences because I had an international upbringing. My parents lived everywhere, but it was sheltered and protected in a sense. And I was actually pleasantly surprised when I came here to Aruba to see how many different nationalities and cultures are existing next to each other. What does that do with a country? How does a country like Aruba, which is actually a very young country, and nation building is still going on, how do you position yourself within the Kingdom of the Netherlands? Or how do you really define who is Aruban or not an Aruban? And what does that mean? How do you include everybody in this country in order for them to feel that they are able to participate, that they are part of this society, which is actually the core of the whole discussion regarding diversity and inclusion. So I studied that. I wrote a lot about it. I went to the United States. I lived it, my life, and also as a person, I've been confronted. Who are you? Where are you coming from? The labels that are put on you. What does that mean? Am I that person, or why not? Or why? So the whole idea of your identity formation and development is part also of the discussion and debate on diversity and inclusion. Who are you? Or the other question that you should ask, who do you want to be? And how are you perceived? What kind of perceptions are there out there regarding identities or persons? And what does that do with you? What are the opportunities that you have in a society? And how do you create your own opportunities in order for you to achieve your dreams or your ambitions or whatever? That's all there is about this whole debate.
Yes.
But, that is a little bit, I hope, an explanation or an answer to your question.
Thank you. And I mean, like you said, Paula, it's a very multifaceted issue, right? I mean, and I have been hearing those two words a lot lately, the words of diversity and inclusion in different settings, in a positive way, but also in a less positive way in some aspects, because, there are groups of people who are still fighting to have that, that achieved, and for their own group that they identify with, having it felt for them. Whereas you have groups that, like you said, maybe have never been confronted for many different reasons. It can be, right, if you are in a place where you're a part of the majority, for example, and you don't leave that, the different privileges that may come with that. But also, I think that a lot of people are afraid to confront that reality, because they think that some way, somehow acknowledging it means like it's, like a doomsday or something, like something that has to be negative or bad. So they tend to just like shove it under the rug and pretend like there are no differences. As if like a difference has to necessarily be something bad. But we have, sadly, as a community, not just in Aruba, but in the world, really, created inequalities because we do not acknowledge these differences, and because we do not give inclusion and diversity the space that it requires for it to achieve its maximum potential. And we were discussing a little bit, before today about this topic, and something that we talked about is that, and I always say this when I talk about inclusion, for example, in the setting of people with special needs, for example, that the moment that we are restricting a group, we are restricting the development of everyone. Exactly. And I think that we really need to talk a little bit about that. And I know that you have done research and also read a lot of research, and it has to do with your background on sustainable development and how that really needs to include everyone. So maybe can you explain a little bit, more of how that really works and why it's so important?
Yeah, well, you're asking a lot. Let me see how
you're going to answer it.
To start. Thank you for the question, which is actually a very essential, crucial question regarding this issue. And I really believe that, indeed, if you exclude a group for whatever reason, if it's special needs children or kids, and I work at IPA and I see how important it is within education to include everybody, and special needs kids in Aruba have a difficult time. Actually, we are now preparing, but it's another topic for the follow-up post-COVID research on the quality of life of Aruban youth. And you will see that this group has always been characterized or labeled as because you're different, you are less. And then you actually have to deal with the whole inferiority, superiority complex thing. And that leads ultimately to the whole power dynamic. Who has power and who does not have power? Or who is able to participate and why, and who does not participate and why? Who is being included and why, and who is excluded? And that has to do with the person or the persons that are in a certain power position, or the whole power dynamic in a group that really plays into this exclusion or this inclusion thing. And then it becomes really difficult, because it has to do with, I also said in the last conversation, in the last interview, that we have to deal with the fact that people are perceived, stereotyped, stigmatized, discriminated, and then excluded. So this is the whole layered thing. And then you have to deal with, why is that? What is it that person has that that he or she is included, or why not? And I think that in our society, based on certain power dynamics and power mechanisms, we have to also deal, and it leads to the identity. You're a woman or a man, or do you have a certain education or not? Do you have a certain ethnicity or cultural background or not? What is your socioeconomic background? What is that? Are you handicapped, or are you Do you have a certain kind of sexual orientation? These are all dimensions that society places a label on it, and it actually plays into labels. You are part of that group, and we want you to be included, or you are weird and you are excluded, or you're not part of the mainstream or the dominant group. And I really think that embracing diversity and inclusion has to deal with the fact that do you really want a sustainable future or a sustainable Aruba? Then we have to talk, or we have to have the conversation about inclusion. So it's not anymore a sustainable development. The UN has really announced it should be sustainable, inclusive development. We cannot have this project for a sustainable future if not everybody, wherever, whomever is part of this project. So, and how do you really condition that everybody can participate? Because not everybody wants, or not everybody is at the same level in order to participate. And that's a very difficult challenge, to really include the whole thing. But we are living on a planet that is global. A sustainable inclusive development is a global project, and it's not only the planet, it's also in particular Aruba, or maybe a certain neighborhood in Aruba. How do we achieve that everybody is going to participate? And then we have certain kind of conditions. You have to be able to really contribute, and not and contribute in a sense that you service, that you are a servant, that you are able to serve your community. You have to be able to really be to see yourself as a holistic person, and everybody else as a holistic person, and also be able to really have a network, a social or professional network. You have to be able to be committed and engaged. And everybody should be included, because if you include everybody, isolation and solid a certain sense of being alone will vanish, and you will give people a good sense of themselves, and that good sense that leads to a certain kind of they call it social cohesion, and everybody wants to be included. Everybody wants, in a certain sense, but there is a challenge, because people tend to really like people that looks like them. You have your girlfriends. If I want to feel relaxed or understood, I will phone family, or I will phone some friends somewhere else. And so it is very difficult for people to bridge differences, because that is tiresome. When you're tired, you just want to be understood. You just don't want to talk in another language or understand another dish or really be included, because that takes energy to bridge that difference. So people really like to be understood, and they have certain assumptions about what should be the condition, or that should be actually accepted. So that's a challenge for human beings, to really deal with differences. And in order to feel superior or to feel important, they will label you as inferior, or they will exclude you. And from that, you will get bullying, what now in Aruba is a huge issue in education, and also with the social media. So it is something that is very important in order for us to feel mentally healthy, and also to feel included, and that we take care of our society.
Yes. And, Paula, you said some really important things. And I think that it's really great that you did mention this one aspect of it, which indeed is very important to acknowledge, that it takes work, right? To be inclusive and to be aware of your surroundings, and genuinely, understanding others can be tiresome or exhausting even at times, because it is different. And, our brains are set certain ways. It works in silos. It works with recognition of things that we already know. But we also have the capacity, if we, do it often enough. And that's the thing that I understand. I have, had conversations with people where they'll experience something different once and it was really intense. I had this conversation once with, it's fine. We can find it in a little bit. But, we were talking about something, I think it was pronouns and, how they keep adding new ones. And I think she was saying something about like, how am I going to keep up? And it's so exhausting. But I told her, if you don't do it ever, it's always going to remain hard and it's always going to remain exhausting because you're not exposing yourself to it or, training yourself to learn. And it's the same thing with, what you were saying, the languages. Of course, I mean, we're not going to be able to learn all the languages and that's fine. But if we think about like our community, it takes some effort indeed, especially at the beginning. But once we go over that threshold of where it's exhausting, it becomes second nature to us. And then you start to, reap the fruits, as you say, of it, where you can learn new things. And when you learn to appreciate, become more empathetic. But it's also with needs. And we, like you said, we have the tendency to think from a mainstream point of view or like the dominant group, like you said. So you were saying, something like participating and being of service. And then we have the tendency to think of that in, from a very abled, privileged position and then set those standards of what that would look like.
Yeah, well, privilege is always,
right?
Sometimes, I'm sorry.
Yes, no, that's fine.
It's associated by me sometimes also with entitlement. If it's privilege, it's something else than entitlement. Entitlement comes with a certain kind of arrogance, with a certain kind of positioning yourself as superior and entitled to do certain things, or have a certain life of being included, or being the one that could exclude. Why? What are the criteria? Which criteria are you applying that someone could be excluded? And why is the other included? And that is power. That's the power dynamics that is going on. And so that is very important to me, to analyze that.
Yes, and also to make people aware, because sometimes people get upset when, when they are told that they have privilege because they align it with entitlement. And it doesn't have to be the same thing. Some people with privilege can be entitled, but some people will have privilege, period. And
what do you choose? How do you choose
to use that privilege? And that's the thing that and privilege looks in so many different ways. Again, it's so multi-layered. It really depends. You can talk about privilege in the sense of like money, capital, right? In the sense of looks, again, which also depends on where you are at, in what community you are. And all of these things. But you can also, talk about systems, privileges that come with a government system, for example. Like in Aruba, we have certain privileges like healthcare, education, that are privileges compared to other places. So, but again, it's like what you said, what do you do with it? And how do you
if it's
make
personal,
sure it's not entitlement, right?
Yes, well, when it's personal and informal, in a sense that it is between people, that it's something that in our communities in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, you have a certain right, democratic right to, because you have agency. There are some human rights that are applicable to your life. But sometimes the privilege is institutionalized and you don't know how it works. But it is also a kind of perception that is out there through the institutions, through the companies, the visions, political party. It's a mindset that is anchored into the society, and it's carried through by tradition, how we should live, how the expectations that they have. And if that is institutionalized, then it's very difficult. And that is something that we all have to confront. And it is the way, with the moment that you were born, you will be exposed to a certain way of thinking. Now, you see that by the emancipation and civil rights movement, that is why participation is so important, because if you are able to participate, if it's in a debate, or is it
by voting, for example.
By voting, exactly, then you have a certain kind of right that is given to you to voice your position or to change. But very often people don't see that. And you see that by the emancipation movement of civil rights movement or women's rights movement or now the LBGG movement, you will see that certain institutionalized values and perceptions are being discussed or being challenged. That is the word. And so what does that mean and what are the results of that? Are people being freed for certain expectations, how they should behave, or that they are included or not, or how they should see or experience themselves. And that is something that always is a very difficult discussion, because the freedom of one person should not be a challenge or a limit to other persons. So where does that
line?
Where is that line? Exactly. So I delved in it with my studies and research, because I really believe, because of the fact that I grew up internationally and I was exposed to different culture, which were also clashes. So very Dutch, and then go to Curacao, and now living in Aruba. The perceptions that people have, and what does that mean? And when I speak, it's very Dutch, or when I work, it's very much from a certain kind of context. And then I see the confrontation, and I went into it not only for myself, but also what does that mean worldwide. And when I go to the States, it's a complete every life there, every citizen that you meet, every person that you meet will at a certain moment in the conversation tell you who they are. Because their identity is so important in order for you to understand from which position they are talking or teaching or working or doing business from. And it's very interesting.
Okay.
And also in Aruba, you will see that the notion of nation building, who are we as Aruban, is a constant conversation. Not only who are we, but who are we not? It's not that we exactly know who we are, but we definitely know
who we are not,
or do not want to be. If you understand
Indeed.
what I mean.
Yes. And
if you look through the glasses, and you have the glasses on of diversity, then you will notice that is something that is very much also living in this community.
Yes, and I think that it's important to be aware of it, because, like I already mentioned, people do not want to confront it because then they feel like they're doing something bad.
Yes. It's a very difficult conversation.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is, and also, we have to be honest, and I think people are so afraid to be honest with the fact that sometimes we don't even know, right? We don't even know to what extent we have certain privileges and we are exercising them or not, right? Sometimes people don't even know where they have some sense of entitlement unless it's confronted, and then it's scary. But I always tell people that you're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to grow and learn. So sometimes people are so afraid to express that and then be challenged in that. Like you already said, something, and this is a conversation that I have had many times. What makes you an Aruban? What makes you an able person compared to, somebody with disabilities, for example? And then...
Well, that's access.
Yeah.
It's access and it's opportunity.
Yep.
And I think it's very, very clear that that should be mentioned.
Yes.
That diversity is another word or other concept looking what kind of opportunities do you have, or do you perceive to have, or do people think that you have? And so that is actually the whole thing. It's not only about ethnicity or language or a certain kind of cultural background. It's also what is the access that you have to realize your ambitions or to really contribute to the society or to be really achieving all the objectives that you want to achieve. And that is what we're talking about.
Yes.
And I really like to talk about it in my classes, in my lectures, that, for example, they say, oh, Paula, you're coming again with gender and ethnicity and blah, blah, blah. But it is true that, of course, personally, individually, people can achieve a lot of things in their lifetime. But when we look at in a society level for society, and we analyze institutional exclusion, that what happened a few weeks ago in the States, that Katjani Brown Jackson was able to be nominated and confirmed for a position is huge. It's not because of her alone, but it is huge that that institution, that construction allowed her to be nominated. That never happened again. That never happened before. And so that is something that we really have to think about, that it is not only individual, because I could have more education than that person, and I could be a victim, but you could be also a victim, or someone else could be the how do you say that in English? The dader, the person that really are excluding persons. That is not anymore for me relevant. What is really interesting is how the society react and create opportunities for groups of people that have been excluded or feel or have experienced, because not the perception, it's also the feeling that you are excluded or generationally been excluded, that now suddenly that discussion, that conversation is going on. What is happening? What are the dynamics and why? And how do you perceive it, in order for us to really eliminate all social inequalities and everybody being able to say, well, I am part of this. I'm participating in this conversation or in this society at an equal level. That is what we want.
But it's
because we want an inclusive world.
Yes.
If that is possible, I don't know. But we are trying to create a sustainable, inclusive society.
But again, if like you said, if you're not exposed to it, a lot of people don't, think about it in their daily lives.
It's very tiresome. It's very annoying. It's very irritating. Even it's one of my themes. Sometimes I do not want to think about it because it confronts me, and I'm tired, and I'm like, je zeurt, je klaagt te veel, or whatever. And I understand.
Yep.
I
understand that too.
And I'm like,
yes.
Well, do your best, and then God will do the rest, and don't complain anymore. I understand that.
Yes. No, and that's the thing. And what I have learned as well in the last couple of years working with different organizations, really within our community, I get to meet different people with different needs, and then I am exposed, sometimes for the very first time to a situation that does not affect me or anyone near me in my life. So I was never aware of it. But I also think that a lot of people, do not, and maybe, I don't know, this is also where I kind of, I'm on the fence about it, because to what extent is it like a personal obligation or responsibility for you to become aware of what happens within your society and what groups in your society, are not being included, and how are you pushing for that and promoting that? And to what extent is it the obligation of or responsibility of the people that are, raising us, so be it education, be it like the government or whatever, to make us aware of it. And that is something that I personally struggle with, and I struggle with it with myself, but also with people around me, because like you said, then people will be like, ugh, you're gonna nag about this topic again, Carolina, like we already talked about this. And then I go, no, but listen, we have talked about it, but it's still an issue, and then you talk about it, and then sometimes I catch up with friends because, a discussion gets a little bit heated, and then I have more one-on-one conversations, and then they go like, you have to be patient, you have to be a little bit more gentle, because not everybody is exposed to the same. But at the same time, not everyone has the same interest to also become aware of.
Yes.
And that
is not any more relevant for me. No,
I was like, I don't care.
I am teaching about it in a sense. I'm raising consciousness among young people, young students. In the corporate world, in the business community, and in the private sector, you will see that it's a very much a business-like strategy. It's not anymore do you feel should you do it or not? No, if you do not include people, you don't get the money that you need to get, because we actually have to acknowledge that the world is diverse. It is multicultural, and if you want to get a big market, you need to be thinking inclusive. So it's now business strategy, which is actually the best strategy to really apply, because then you don't have to deal with all kinds of emotions or concepts or equality thing. It's just money. It's just market strategy, and so that
and it's a
works.
motivator. It's an extrinsic motivator that works, has always worked. So yeah,
big companies are now confronted with the fact that they need to reflect the society that they are actually catering for. If they don't do it, if they don't include diversity in their PR or whatever, they will not get the money or the market that they aim for, because that market has changed dramatically, and there are a lot of new groups that are having more money than ever. So you need to tap into that. So that kind of strategy works always.
Nice.
Because then it's efficient, it's really something that is goal-oriented, and you don't need to deal with a lot of things that are value-oriented or normative or something like that, which is actually the basis. Should be the basis.
Yes.
But
the more moral obligation point of view. Yeah.
But if I deal with people that are really like liberal or conservative, I think, well, what about the money? What about the finances? And then you cut out that discussion, because that always in certain groups works. But it is also something that I really believe that you cannot achieve sustainable development if you do not allow people access, or that you will be able to, one way or the other, conditioned a certain kind of opportunities for people. Because the cost of excluding people are always bigger than including. And it's with health. You are very active in all kinds of organizations about health. If you are able, and I am a daughter of a public health man, and I was taught with the pap label, they say it in Dutch, that if you as a salud público agency do not invest in prevention, you don't see the rendement immediately.
Exactly.
But at least you don't have the cost after that, with diabetes, with cancer, with all kinds of things right now. And it is the same now with mental health, with the mental health crisis going on in
and
Aruba.
then you have to acknowledge the diverse aspects of it, because you cannot cater services. You know, it's not one size fits all, and people,
the money, the costs are so much bigger than that if you exclude people. Dus if you include people, that will be much more a sustainable way of really being able to cater for people that are marginalized, vulnerable groups, or left out. The moment that groups are left out, one way or the other, it will come back to you.
Exactly.
And that is much more, that's not even money-wise, but that is spiritually, it comes back to you. Because they feel discriminated, they feel unsatisfied, they feel unhappy, unhealthy. It's not the way forward. And then you as a government or as a board need to really start a conversation. How do you include them? And it costs so much more money and so much more time. Why should you do that? That is one of the questions
Yes.
that I really think is interesting, because in embracing diversity and setting out to be inclusive, which is really an energy drain. I have to emphasize that. You have to bridge. You have to be able to deal with the notion of the other. Not me, but the other. What does that person want or need to in order for us to have the conversation or to participate? That is very, very confronting. But if you don't do that, then you will get all people being marginalized, vulnerable, and that is not a healthy society. That's not a sustainable way of living, of working together.
No, and it impacts us one way or the other, and that's the thing, that people think that just because it doesn't affect like their household or their family,
Yes.
right, that it won't impact them or that it won't affect them, but it does, and it's one way or the other. It's
The thing
you know?
is, that is, sorry to interrupt, one thing, otherwise I forget. The thing is, though, I understand in the process of developing, in the process of identifying yourself for who you are, there is a phase, and it is really analyzed within development studies, that you really need to focus on yourself.
okay.
In het papimento, we say in our communities, nos con nos. If you go to Netherlands, it is ons kent ons. And it is safe. It's soort, zoekt soort. You know each other. You know what you can expect. There are no drama or traumas that will result out of that. But the thing is, if you have this philosophy or this notion, nos con nos, you exclude people. And what you see with the growing globalization and growing multiculturalism, also in Aruba and Curacao in the Netherlands and the States, that people are, and you see it in the formation of certain political parties and political philosophies, that they have this nostalgia going back from the time it was easy, or we were one nation, or we were one island, Arubans. And then you see that they are going to tap in a certain canon, really developing a canon. Well, Arubans, they like Pangbati. That is really, and they will really highlight and canonize certain cultural traits that will identify or, define who you are. And that is difficult for me, because then it really leads to xenophobia, that you are not willing to include that other person. You see it in the Netherlands with the political parties like Van Geert Wilders and Baudet. You see it with what is happening till now with a certain electorate from the Trump government. It's very difficult.
It is.
Because with the inclusion of certain groups, some groups feel excluded. They feel inferior. They don't have certain kind of access. So how do you bring that together? And there is a kind of a fear
Of
that
losing
the other,
power, maybe?
losing power or not being seen or being small. And you can see it also in micro level, not only within the kingdom or the state, but even on an island of Aruba, that certain neighborhoods or districts are being perceived as very dominant, and that is being represented in political parties. And it's very interesting to see what the tradition and the history is behind that feeling left out or feeling discriminated against. And it's it is a very complex task or assignment to really see Aruba as one nation, because there are all these different positions and identities that are in this conversation on who is Aruban, but they are excluding certain groups or districts.
And I also think it has a lot to do with, being afraid of losing what you know, right? And you were talking about it, the very clear pushback that you see, right, with some political parties, that it's becoming clearer where, they want to stick to a status quo or what they perceived as a status quo.
But I do understand, because when I'm in Rotterdam and I'm at the central station from Rotterdam, and I'm like, where are the Rotterdammers? I only see people from Curacao or Africa, and I'm like, oh my God, the autochtone Rotterdammer cannot recognize himself anymore if he sees the people walking around in his city. And I can also understand that people from Aruba, they're like, okay, where is my Aruba? I mean, there are so many different, if it's not tourists or people coming here working for a while, it's a difficult confrontation. And that nostalgia also in the Netherlands, particularly in provinces, that they say, but we are Dutch and now we have to deal with the refugees from Ukraine or Syria. So there is a sense of understanding that it will attack your sense of safety. It will attack or question your sense of belonging. Where do you belong? And who are you? And you need that kind of protection. You need that kind of connection in order to feel good.
Yes.
So that is,
And yes, and I agree on all of those things. But I also think that we tend to tie those things to, for example, power. So you can have your identity within like your group, and that does not have to mean that you have to exclude other people. And that's where I think that a thin line exists. So you can still be an Aruban, whatever that means to, each of you, while also not necessarily having to exclude a certain group just because they don't fit into that.
Yeah.
And that's the thing where people, I think, are afraid of losing that power.
or claiming that power.
Or claiming.
Claiming that power, because if you are really including, you have to be able to govern or manage that every position or every person or group has the equal distribution of
that
influence. Let me put it that way. And if one group of one person says, "But I feel more inferior," or is perceived as more inferior because he has more access or information or a certain kind of network or funding, then it becomes very difficult. And that is the whole thing. And that is why we have to talk about power and the power dynamics behind the whole concept of diversity and inclusion. Because who decides who is included and who decides who is excluded?
Exactly.
And that's
a never-ending discussion. Or, I mean, we haven't found that, right?
Certainly.
But what we have seen in trying to gap that, and that is also something that we discussed, and I do want to discuss it a little bit, is when we talk about affirmative action, right? And this is a discussion, and here in Aruba, we haven't really seen it much, or I haven't seen it, honestly, in organizations. But I also studied in the U.S. where it was very clear, where schools and organizations, for them, it's... at the beginning for me, it was kind of confronting why certain information was being asked of me, and it was everywhere. It was, at my pharmacy, it was at my physicians, it was at school, it was, at any place that I went to either work or volunteer. Like, they were requesting certain information in regards to my status, right? Whether or not I was an American citizen or not, my ethnicity, which for me was very confronting because it was the first time for me where I really had to sit with that. What am I? There was no Aruban box, so,
Oh, there is, believe me.
But, just having to think about that, and then just further thinking about it and just researching about it, where we have gotten to the point in trying to gap that power dynamic and that influence and decision-making dynamic, whereas to trying to create numbers to represent that into percentages that have to be achieved. And there's a lot of discussion into that where, other countries look at the US, for example, and that model that is being used there basically in the whole country, and that they're afraid that, the world is going to have to move towards that. But maybe we can discuss that a little bit and how it works. And
Well,
and we're not going to say if it's right or wrong, but, at least just discuss a little bit.
Yes, well, affirmative action is a policy instrument to really strategize the unequal distribution of access. And in that sense, it is a way of dealing with the fact that certain groups were always more privileged or had more access to certain positions, function, and salaries. And in that sense, it is a way of managing the inequality that we have to face in a multicultural society or world. So what does that do? The impact is not always have not always been seen or experienced as positive, because then you will have a person that, because of affirmative action, get a certain position, and then he or she has to prove himself, because people or colleagues will say, yeah, but you got it because you are a woman, or you got it because you are a person of color, or because you're handicapped. And so that diminishes the value of the certain professionalism that person should have. Because we have to agree that affirmative action only works when we acknowledge that person has the same qualities or qualifications as the other person that always would be selected to get that kind of promotion or job. So you will see that, for example, in northern Scandinavian countries, they have this affirmative action for women in certain big corporations, but also in the government, and it works. And so in that sense, you will see that it has been an affirmative action that every big corporation should have certain kind of percentage of women in board or in their board or in their higher echelons of that company, in order for them not to say it's only men that are in managerial or in leadership positions. And I think that the way that they did it, and the Netherlands is trying to do it right now, is something that we can look upon, because it really also share the response. They also were able to institute certain kind of facilitation for parents, young parents. So pregnancy leave but also parent leave are equal for men and women. And so the whole debate on the whole issue of care responsibility and work responsibilities or obligations are now being divided for men and women. And I like that. Because parenting is something that men and women should have right to, and in this way, it's the government, the society that carries that kind of the cost. Therefore, in the States, it's a little bit more complex, because in the States you have the whole thing with the African American communities and other ethnicities that are prominent in the fabric of that society. And I teach also about it, and you will see that America, the States, has always been labeled as a melting pot. And so all kinds of refugees and migrant are attracted to the States because if you work hard, that is the premise.
Yes, the American dream, right?
The American dream will be able for you. You can be successful, earn a lot of money, and lead a life that is beyond your dreams. And true, you will see some celebrities that come from humble beginnings, from Colombia or wherever, and they made it in the States. They could not have made it on that level in their own country. And so that is the promise of America, but you will see that not everybody has the same access. So what does that mean? And then we have to deal with exclusion, we have to deal with the whole slavery history, of course, or the way that certain ethnic communities are being perceived, and also right now are being marginalized, the Asian community, for example.
I was going to say, yeah.
And you have other communities that are really being hit. And so it's a very difficult question now, how this American dream is available for everybody. And affirmative action is going to help to promote or to open access for everybody. I think it's a very complex society. If you compare it with Canada, who has other kind of vision for migrants, and you will see that they call their cultural fabric the mosaic approach, which is much more friendly for migrants, because they will say, well, please hold on to your identity, celebrate the difference that you bring to us, our country, and it's a huge country, but just contribute from your position, from your cultural background to our community. So you will see that in Canada, they will have tension, they have tension,
of course,
but it is not as so explosive as in the States.
Exactly. And
in the States, they have this melting pot approach, and the melting pot approach actually says you have to be a certain kind of American. If you are not able to fulfill that American definition of self, then you're not going to be able to succeed, whatever that means.
Or fully participate.
Participate. And when you are able to participate, you integrate. The moment that you do not participate, you are not integrating. And when you're not integrated, you will be excluded of information, of opportunities, of hearing about projects, and also of not being able to be part of the group that contributes. And that's very important.
Yes.
And a sense of self and a sense of belonging.
And again, I also think it's how, these conversations are being held in different, aspects. So, in my case, and I can talk, from my personal experience and then looking as to the more theoretical side of it. But I remember when I decided to go study in the U.S. and my parents lived in the U.S. for some years. They knew that system. But this is not a conversation we had. For some reason, that is not something that, came to their minds of like, oh, by the way, you're gonna have to
be careful.
Yes.
What is your position on this? Or
Yes.
you will be asked or questioned about
Exactly.
your position on that.
So they didn't have that conversation with me. So when I was confronted with it, they kind of had like, oh, moment. And it's like, oh yeah, they had those conversations with my siblings because they lived there when they were growing up. But because in my case, it was, I guess, a different setting.
And you were a student on yourself.
Yes, exactly. But I also felt that there wasn't, when I questioned, for example, my mentor with it or my advisor who was helping me out, and as an international student, you usually are received by an international office which has people looking all kinds of different ways. But then when you ask these questions, and I love asking questions. So, of course, I went. It's like, why do I have to fill this in? And nobody could really, it was hard for me to get a real answer. So I had to go through several people before somebody could explain, how it works and how it matters. It also matters for access for certain funds. It matters for many different things. So what you feel on that has an impact on your accessibility, on your own personal, but also for the whole institution, what they receive, if they are, meeting certain goals or not. But after realizing how long it took for me to get an answer, somebody who was able to explain it to me, I realized that there's probably a bunch of other students walking around here who have no idea why they have to fill in those boxes. So like what you said, then they are confronted with the reality, right, that it exists and they don't understand why or how it works. And then they'll say something like, oh, but you don't deserve to be here. You're just here because this or that. Yes. And I do have to say that, it can get ugly in educational institutions. Yes. We did see a huge scandal. And now I can't remember which Ivy League school it was. I'm not going to throw them under the bus. But it was an Ivy League school. And one of the two big ones, yes, the names are probably popping into your brain. Yes. But where in that aspect, they, started to impede a group of students, Asian students, basically. The entry requirement for them was being set much difficult or harder because they were surpassing the percentage that they were supposed to make up of the school. And that was becoming a problem for the school. So then they used that same, policy that was there to supposedly create some balance to exclude a group yet again, limit their access. So I understand, so I understand why people can be on the fence of it. And I think that policies are as good as the people who are there to execute them, right?
And the moment that policies, instruments are not necessary anymore, you have reached your goal. And the objective, and that is what you want. So these strategy instruments should always be perceived as temporary. The thing with these Ivy League schools, but also a lot of those academic institutions in the States, there's another thing going on right now in this globalized world. Is it's very, very fashionable right now to be global.
That's a nice way of putting it. Fashionable, yep.
Yeah, it's very fashionable. So if you are able to say that you're a global institution, you can attract not only local or national elites, but you can attract elite from Japan, elite from Asia, from the States, from the Africa, from Europe. And that is what you want, because there's a whole new thing going on with this global world, is that we want to be cosmopolitan. And the whole cosmopolitanism concept is something that these Ivy League or these academic institutions tap into. Also, you see this trend in the Netherlands that a lot of academic institutions are also trying to be global, and they offer master or PhD programs and even bachelor program in English. English is the killer language next to Spanish, and you have to be able to really dominate one of these languages in order to compete with them. And there are certain stereotypes on Asian students. They are always perceived as better, and they have
smarter and
smarter. So there's this competition with the other ethnic groups that also are competing to get in, which is very difficult. Is one way of strategizing this and excluding them, or creating certain kind of obstacles in order for you to legitimize what you are doing, or because of the fact that you are being criticized as an institution, that you are actually, you trekt bepaalde groepen voor. You are actually favoritism.
Yes.
So that is the backlash that I think that the Asian community is experiencing now in the States, and which is actually very traumatic. And so it's a very difficult thing, because again we have to question the power dynamic and why and what is the whole ideology behind it. And so you will see that some of these institutions are really competing on a global level to be the best. And that means that you have to really set out globally who you want to attract, and it's not only anymore the local, how do you say, elite, or the local intelligentsia that you want to attract, but it is someone also from London or from Hong Kong or from Sydney or from Madrid, and that creates a whole new dynamic.
Yes, for sure.
Yes, and then you will see, which is very interesting, that diversity is now commodity. Diversity is now being seen as one way to really portray yourself as an institution of organization, as being there in the market. Actually, you cannot be anymore an institution of a certain kind of reputation, of being renowned, if you are not automatically diverse. So the whole diversity, which was a problem, being seen as a problem years ago, decennia ago, is now being seen as something that you need to portray, to really present yourself with, because otherwise you're not global. And globalism or globalization is embracing diversity. So it's a new turn, and how do you present it, and how do you deal with that? And you will see that in the research that I've done before I came to Aruba was the emphasizing the positive sides of diversity. So we had to look into the creative economy and the creative sector, and then you see all these people living in all kinds of countries. They become in Amsterdam the director of a museum or the director of a certain organization, and they are all foreigners. They're all foreigners. And so to really compete, a museum like Stedelijk or Vincent van Gogh, they cannot tap anymore from the Dutch pool. They have to tap worldwide and attract a director from a museum in Los Angeles to become a director of a museum in Amsterdam. So that has fundamentally changed in order for us to really also emphasize the positive sides of diversity.
Yes, and that's the thing, right? I think that, like you said, especially for organizations, if we think about like the private sector or the for-profit organizations, they tend to be ahead in these things because it directly impacts their profit margin, and that's a reality. And I always tell people, when they get upset, like, oh, now this company is like great, if they're on board, great, I love it, good for them. I'm not gonna fight them for doing the thing that we have wanted them to do. And like you said, ideally, or we would like to think that it comes maybe from like a moral place, but it doesn't always. And it's confronting sometimes for some people, but I have learned as somebody who runs an organization that its whole goal is to create awareness. I had to really let that go. That everybody that I meet is trying to help from a moral place. I really had to let that go. And it's fine, because at the end of the day, the end goal is being reached. And that for me...
Hopefully.
Yes, that for me is important, right? So that's one, but and I'm happy to see that. But now I feel like we also have to go back to more of these informal settings where these inequalities still happen.
Yes.
So I am happy that on organizational levels and policy levels, we are seeing different steps being taken towards this. But now is the point that, again, like Dr. Paula said, it's exhausting sometimes, always, every day, to have these discussions and these arguments and these conversations. And maybe you do not have to have them every day, but they are important for it to truly work in this everyday sense of belonging, and not just, okay, I am here and I am participating in this workplace, but I am being still treated differently or perceived differently. That is where I think that we still have to work and be honest with ourselves when we see it, when we feel it, and see what we can do or can't do about it, because again, yes, like you said, you will have a school with certain percentages being met, but the mingling that happens within.
Yes. Actually, I supervised 2 theses last year.
Mm-hmm.
One was actually about the representation of women in the tourist sector here in Aruba, which was very interesting, because it was stated and acknowledged that a lot of the CEOs in the touristic sector in Aruba are foreigners.
Okay.
So that already explains a lot, because Aruba has big conglomerate hotel
chains
here, and so they will send someone that will be able to do their work for the headquarters here in Aruba, and they have to meet certain objectives. The other thesis that was very interesting, that was from a very well-known bank on our islands, and that is run by foreigners on the island, but very progressive, very lenient to women's demand, but all the women in top positions were foreigners. So the local women were feeling left out, because it is women-friendly, but they said, we are not being considered for the top positions. Because the women that are selected are coming from that specific country, and they are actually parachuted in our communities. So where are we? Where am I? I know the community, I have my degree, but it is a foreign person that is actually leading the company on the island that I'm from. So that kind of tension is now being seen and
felt.
Felt. And now studies are being now executed, and I'm like, this is interesting, because I'm a product of international parent socialization. I'm like, I like to be international oriented, but I have been confronted on the islands about what that means. People see you as a threat, or people don't understand you, or you don't have anchors, you don't know certain situations or cultural
nuances.
Nuances. People have to fill you in.
Oh yes.
People perceive you in a way, and I'm like, who is that? That's not me. But they perceive you like that. And that kind of position I liked in a certain way because, you feel I'm an outsider within, as I say, I describe myself. But it has also some negative. The other people that from the island that did come back, they feel left out. They feel diminished. They don't feel acknowledged. And then you will see a certain kind of xenophobism or a nostalgia, which you also see in the Netherlands, going back to where the things were good long time ago in the 50s or in the 60s. And I don't know if that is healthy, but it's understandable.
Yes.
And you see it now also in Aruba, in the touristic sector, and also in Curacao. You see that people in certain companies or organizations are feeling left out because of the fact that the top is not representing them, but actually representing a headquarter in another country.
Yes.
So what does that do with the opportunities that you thought you had?
I think these are very interesting conversations, and I do not think that we can,
I'm looking at my time.
Yes, it's time for us to wrap up, Paula. But thank you so much, and it's such a complex conversation, but I did want us to, think a little bit about all that goes into it. And maybe your brain is going, oh my gosh, right now. Maybe you're exhausted after this episode.
No, I am like, okay, I know so many things. What did I say?
No, but I do hope, because the goal of Sincerely Carolina is to encourage, each and every one of you and myself in the process, obviously, to think, to consider things that maybe we haven't considered before, and think about things that we haven't thought about before. Because again, everything is connected. So our lives, our community, our society, everything that we do, decisions that we make. So I know that it's easier to not have to think about others and the impact that our decisions and choices make, but that's not the reality. So I do hope that Sincerely Carolina gives you a place to think about that and maybe learn a thing or two, or make you curious about a thing or two, and tapping into that, whatever that may be. Paula, is there anything else that you want to say before we close off?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. No, really, thank you so much. I really think it's an important discussion. And
Yes.
I also understand it's sometimes a complex conversation, but I really like the conversation, Carolina, and I really think it was courageous of you to really put it on the agenda. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And I love it. So I do think that we will have more of these type of conversations in different contexts, right? So this was a diversity and inclusion series where I talked about different topics that, in my opinion, were important to target. And I will not ever be able to discuss about everything always, but I do my best. So if you have topics out there that you think that are really, really important that we should be discussing, please do let me know. For the coming episodes, I do want to talk a little bit about moms, because of course Mother's Day is coming up, or moms and parenting, really, because it's going to connect right into Father's Day afterwards. But I will talk a little bit about that, and we shortly talked a little bit about those parenting dynamics. So for next week, I am going to talk about an issue that I have been passionate about for some time. So it's about teen moms, what that means, that impact that has on our society or community, but for the person itself, why, and anyways, some of it. So I'm excited to have those conversations. We will also be talking in the coming episodes about parents' rights. So when we think about parental leave, so what it looks like here in Aruba, but also rights that come within that. So you can think about stuff like breastfeeding, how that's, regulated in the law, stuff like that, because I do want us to be aware of what our situation looks like, but also why it looks the way it looks like now, and maybe where we should be moving towards. But thank you so much for tuning in and for caring about things that I care about. I hope you learned something. Be pending for Wednesday. I will see if I will post a question. Maybe it's a rhetorical one. I don't know yet. And then you can win some awesome prizes from one of my awesome sponsors. I hope you have a nice week, and let me know what you thought about this episode. Let Dr. Paula know what you thought about this episode, and I will see you again next week. Bye!
Sincerely Carolina is powered by Lindy Boutique, Proframe, Gelatissimo, Neutrogena, and Purina.